Eklanete Denesotlaneta Eriel Tchekwie Deranger Betsiani Hesli. My name is Eriel Tchekwie Deranger, and I'm a member of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation and the Executive Director and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action. Indigenous Climate Action is Canada's first Indigenous-led climate justice organization. And the mandate and the vision of our organization is to empower and inspire Indigenous communities to be sovereign and self-determining nations and building their own Indigenous-led climate action strategies across the country. One of the most compounding and intersectional issues in social justice is climate justice. And in Canada, or so-called Canada, there are many Indigenous peoples working on issues that could support climate solutions, but are often not looked at or supported in that way. So how do we look at Indigenous climate action as viable solutions for tomorrow? We have unique rights of Indigenous peoples that have been defined under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which looks at our collective rights as communities, but also our collective rights in relationship with the natural world. And so Indigenous rights come with their own very tangible connection to ecosystems, landscapes, and places in which we have come from. The word dene in my language, when you break it down in its root form, means to flow from the land. So we have these unique systems, but those systems and values haven't been included in the way that we look to frame economic systems of modern governance, education, and so on and so forth. And as the climate disaster has increased, so have many of the injustices towards Indigenous peoples. Not being able to access clean, healthy water because many of our communities are still connected to the land. My community, the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, until about 30 years ago was 80% subsistence. 80% subsistence. And the only reason that number has decreased is because of the imposition of oil and gas projects within our territory and the contamination and degradation to our ecosystems, making those subsistence foods unsafe to eat.
I grew up in the boreal forest, so we were very land-based people. When I was a kid, 70% of our food came from the land. So we ate, wild chickens, rabbits, ducks, deer, moose. We also picked a lot of berries. And our water. We got our water from the ground. I'll never forget how clean and fresh and cold that water was. Experiencing the changes, being really land-based, to all of a sudden we have water being hauled to us, this treated water that tasted like bleach. I understood that there was changes happening.
So Indigenous Climate Action was really born out of this need from Indigenous communities to see themselves as a part of addressing the climate crisis. For 15 years, I was working within the environmental and climate justice movement in so-called North America. And there weren't a lot of Indigenous peoples leading these conversations, participating in these conversations. And yet our communities were often asked to give words or share their knowledge. But they weren't being included at some of the highest levels of discussions, but rather we were just there to talk about how bad climate change was for us. It's kind of like that sort of victimization model. And so in 2015, I, leaned on a lot of friends and allies, put together an advisory council, and formed the first inaugural meeting for Indigenous Climate Action in January of 2016, which brought together about 150 Indigenous representatives from across the nation to discuss climate change with some of the leading Indigenous voices in climate justice, like Tom Goldtooth, Art Manuel, Winona LaDuke, Ellen Gabriel, Chief Stuart Phillip, all these really incredible voices that have been participating in the UN Forum Convention on Climate Change, that have been participating in many UN dialogues, as well as national and regional policies on climate change, to show folks we are a part of the conversation and we do have value in these conversations. At the end of 2017, it became like a full-fledged organization because between 2015 and 2017, it was all volunteer. I had another full-time job and I was doing it off the side of my desk. I took a leap of faith. I quit my job where I was working for my First Nation, and I decided to help steer the ship of what has now become Indigenous Climate Action.
Eriel is one of the most powerful people that I've gotten the pleasure of meeting in my life. I met Eriel a few years ago at the Indigenous Climate Action gathering that we had out in Cold Lake First Nations, where I'm from. We really got to know each other when we went to Ecuador together to bear witness to the Warani case to protect 500,000 acres of Amazon rainforest.
5% of the global population is Indigenous peoples, but we protect and steward 80% of the world's biodiversity. We are the protectors of the land.
The Reject Tech campaign was a huge one. They were creating this mega project in the north.
We already had issues with how much fresh water was being used, how much land was being cleared, how much air pollution was happening, deforestation. And then all of a sudden comes a company like Tech saying that they're going to be the biggest project to date.
The project was this massive project in an area that had been completely untouched, basically for millennia. There is nothing up there, no development, no transmission lines, no roads, nothing. And they started doing exploration drilling for the Tech Frontier mine. And in order for this project to be developed, they would need to develop a bridge that got across the river to the area. They'd have to develop roadways and systems. They'd have to pull in transmission lines so that they could power the operations or build a power station. They would have to build an airstrip. They would have to build in a massive amount of infrastructure just to power one project. For fighting this project, it became about how do we create awareness? How do we get more information to ensure that people understand that this project is, in fact, moving us in the wrong direction? When we can take information from institutions like IEEFA, bring them to the table and say, this isn't just about us being angry that we can't hunt, fish, and trap, but this is about a project that is not economically viable and that is being criticized as part of an international movement that we need to move away from fossil fuels, period. End of story. Like, these are our allies in this movement. And so we took it upon ourselves to make tech one of the biggest issues of the UN COP meeting. So the UNFCCC COP 25 in Madrid. We ran this campaign at the COP. We called it Reject Tech. We asked Canada to reject the Joint Review Panel recommendation to approve the project and ran this campaign for a few months.
There was a lot happening, and we were really trying to figure out the different ways that the minister might take it. If he was to approve, if he was to deny, and if he was to approve with conditions. We were thinking about trying to head out to Ottawa and do some lobbying. There's plans underway for different kinds of direct action. We saw the group Extinction Rebellion do a National Day of Actions.
There were protests happening all over the place. People were pretty upset about this project. And as Canada continued to sit on whether or not they were going to approve, Tech came forward and just said, you know what? We're going to reject ourselves because they realized that, in fact, just like many of the IEEFA reports had stated and other reports, that this was not an economically smart investment, that this was a project that had a lot of contention around it, and that it was no longer in their best interest to move forward with the project, and the project was canceled.
That pristine forest up there is going to be pristine for a lot longer now. So that's a beautiful thing.
There's just so much knowledge we have because we are in the communities on the water all the time, not just to go for a hiking trip or a camping trip. We live there. So we know the land and the history of the land. I really encourage people to take the time to learn more about Indigenous rights, because Indigenous rights is tied to protecting the land. And if our Indigenous rights are protected, it ensures that you have an existence, that your kids have a future, because we're working hard to protect the land, not only for us, but for everybody.
We still have an opportunity to safeguard what's left. And we can do that together with allies and partnership and empowering our communities to really pave the way for what an Indigenous climate justice future looks like, which isn't just about, making sure we've reduced the greenhouse gas emissions or have solar power, because we need all of those, but it also must include what it means to be in relationship with the land, to be dene, to flow from the land. you.